The unknown is in Enchanted Limit. And whenever we think of enchanting, we have to know that it's a chant, it's an incantation. And there's a way in which this calling out is what we are thinking about when we take you to a factory floor where people are calling out to each other. And by people, I mean people who are human flesh and blood and people who are circuits and wires, such as robots. Over the years, we've made friends with some robots. And here's this conversation that made its way into a newsprint manga. Perhaps a storyboard for a film that could be made one day featuring workers and robots in a factory. If you remember, the word robot comes from that play by Karel Čapek, Rossum's Universal Robots. And it's the same word in Russian, Ukrainian, Slavic, Czech for worker, rabota. Robot, the sparky one, ruminates. The noun called robot is originally an adjective called worker. Sometimes when I see you face to face as a worker sipping her tea, I'm puzzled about whether I am your ancestor or your inheritor. Will I be left cleaning the mess after you leave, or have we made you to clean the mess? A worker finishes her book, reading her book, and looks up. I've been told there's an uncertain age in wait, and that you are the herald and we are in decline. A worker poet pitches in. My time runs in fathoms, but it runs out in seconds. There's never enough. What time is it? Another worker opens a manual and reads. Do I see a little spot of hesitation, a doubt in the command line, a doubt within the fragile ethical grounds of wage-based minds? A worker looks up from the manual. We put too much weight on whether or not you cancel us by simply appearing on the horizon. A worker engineer pitches in. Give me a rule and I'll give you an exception. A distracted robot says. Then back to basics, back to the drawing board, present and future, back to back. A calm robot chants. Could be said that there is a doubt inside every robot and a robot inside every worker. So you could find your inner doubt by talking to your inner robot. A worker cook. And it's the end of the lunch hour. All right, let's start again. Tell us who you are and why you are here.
So there are reasons why discussions around the machinic and the robotic and the relationship that we have with the machine are figuring today, some of which will become clearer as we keep talking. And some I think will be unpacked in the conversation that we're going to have after we've put some ideas in front of you. But for now, we'll just start talking about the Voyager, which was a space probe, the Voyager 1 space probe that was launched on the 5th of September, 1977. And given that no human being has ever traveled as far as the Voyager probe has now, each one of its 733 kilograms adds up to a traveling token for the totality of every human being that has ever lived on the Earth. The probe, fashioned by human hands, imagined by human minds, and adrift in space, is currently some 21.2 billion kilometers away from home. The Voyager 1 space probe carries a record, an analog gramophone, an image of which you see here, known as the golden record or the golden disc, engraved with symbols and drawings and laden with recordings of sounds ranging from volcanoes and earthquakes and thunder to the vocalizations of wild animals and birds, to the sounds of a kiss, of a heartbeat, of human speech, including the obvious greetings from Earth in several languages, as well as music. Okay, so things are not working here, but basically this is a piece of music. It's a recording of a song, as it says over here, Ja Kahan Ho Gori, in Bhairavi, which is a morning love by the Goanese Hindustani classical singer Kesar Bhai Kekar. And Ja Kahan Ho Gori Akeli means where do you wander alone? It was suggested to the team producing the Golden Record by the ethnomusicologist Robert Brown. And in the beginning, this recording seemed impossible to find. I'm going to just stop it. I'm not able to make it work properly. In the beginning, this recording seemed impossible to find. But whenever Brown was told of the difficulty of locating it, he would say, keep looking. And finally, a copy of the gramophone record with the song was located in an appliance store owned by an Indian family on Lexington Avenue, New York City, actually. Migrants had come bearing songs from one world to another. And this is how music travels from one land to another, and then from another land into space. And this is how, in that sense, ideas of home and place and all ideas really travel. But so the question then became for us, when we heard this story, is that what is this thing when this golden record, what is the idea that it will encounter another kind of intelligence, an alien intelligence, not a human intelligence, not intelligence as we understand it to be. And how is it going to decipher it? This is, of course, one of those questions that aggravates and fascinates everybody. Like, what is the mode of communication? How to confine that interface that makes sense to something that perhaps has no form of intelligence as we understand it. But if this other intelligence, if this AI, this alien intelligence were to come across the record, it could be forgiven for being confused. But is this record an artifact, or is it a dead or frozen life form? It makes sound perhaps, but what kind of life form is it? And we all know that our own history is replete with artifacts which live on as living entities. We give them the name of God. We think that they act directly in our lives. The alien form of life could ask us, or ask, while encountering this thing, who are you and what made you? And these two questions could mark a threshold between both knowing and not knowing what life is, or what intelligence is, or what sentience is, or whether the idea of intelligence itself is this question of natural or artificial. What is the relationship that one has? The robots talked about doubt. That was one order of conversation that the robots had with the worker, but they asked us to look within. And so the question of natural and artificial intelligence opens out in a different way with the Golden Record. But this reminds us of the essay that we shared with you.
Gyan Chauset, Mandi Chauhatte, Sarat Pasa Sar, Ya Dunya Mein Rachi Bazi, Jeet Bhavai Har, Sadhu Sant Mahant Dhyani, Chalat Kat Pukar, Lal Girdhar, Jeevan Dinchar. Knowledge is a game, dice roll, players rise and fall, but the world declares all bets are off, because victory is defeat. Good Lord, listen, be wise, your knowing days are numbered. And that's written by Mirabai, a 16th century Rajput princess, rebel, and mystic. And it has this wonderful radical embrace of uncertainty. And when I hear the words now, dice roll, players rise and fall, the world declares all bets are off, I'm thinking, was Mirabai thinking about what's happening in Eastern Ukraine right now? Dice are rolling, players are rising and falling, bets are off, but it's that uncertainty. So the uncertain or the unknown is as an enchanted limit, not necessarily an insult to the seeker of knowledge. Possible directions that propel us towards many forms of unknown, including the machinic unknown, which produces vast sums of knowledge through the interaction of algorithms. We recently wrote an essay which is talking about the ontology of the image. And we came to this realization while working on that essay, is that there are all these forms of image making in the world, that there are many more images that are made now by machines doing their own thing through surveillance cameras, through satellite imagery, than have ever been made by humans. And we don't know what looking at those machines and those stored hard drives, or those ephemera, the detritus of that image making, what picture it actually makes of the world. And that's kind of a strange thing to think about, that accumulating unknown of the visual.
I mean, it's quite interesting, right? Because those images, the ones that are being made in billions, they are not ever seen. So they emerge and they collapse, or they get erased without ever having a human eye on them, which means that there is never any kind of quote unquote natural intelligence that is ever going to gaze upon them. So, and it is an image that is never seen an image at all. Like, how does one understand the facticity of the image that exists technically, but because it never encounters the gaze, it never gets seen, does it remain unknown? Does it remain unbecome? Is it a form of knowledge which exists because at some point we can turn to it? But it's also kind of unknowing, or a lack of knowledge, because no one has actually encountered what the image is. And so this is something we've thought about a lot, is the relationship also between, so whether one encounters something and in that encounter finds ways to parse it. But then we also know that that which is not encountered, or that which is not expressed in the ways that we think of, it still has the kind of excess that we try and find modes of expressing. So Raqs often invents words. Here we take on board the fact that there is a long history of it. Many words are invented by many people. And what is interesting about the making of new words is not the fact that they're simply the fact that they're inventions and a form of expressing the fact that you don't know, but you know, and you try and find a way to bridge that gap. Because we also know that knowledge or knowing of something and language actually go hand in hand. It is not that you have an idea and then you find the language, or that language exists and ideas emerge. It's a kind of a two-step where there is a relationship between words being made and words being found, while ideas become, and while an understanding of something happens at the same time. Anyway, this is one of a series of word films that we made, and the word Drono Sapien, and there are many others. Perhaps we'll come across some more tonight. But I just want to read a little fragment of text that we wrote in 2003, actually, when we had begun Sarai, and we were, we can talk about Sarai, a place for multiple horizon clashes, attempts at interdisciplinarity, trying to bring together different kinds of fractions and factions of how one looks at what was happening around us at that time in New Delhi. And we wrote, we are all algorithms. We are repeated instances of attempts to configure meanings in a world densely packed with signals and messages. We are transmitters and receivers of data, couriers of images, vectors of information. We carry within us the databases of our lives. We are the data we swirl in. Today, we need a mode of cultural practice that can enlarge our sensory, intellectual, and emotional horizons in order to make space for acts of reflection on our lives as data bodies, as fluid and floating clusters of information and meaning. We need a sensory context in which we can examine how we are reflected and multiplied in the compound eye of the apparatus of signs and information that streams through us. We may all be algorithms, but we are not intractable ones.
Yeah, Monica was talking about this question of language as an image. Recently, we've been working a lot with we're studying a syllabary of a language that was invented, not the language, but the alphabet was invented just about 100 years ago by freed slaves who returned from the United States to Liberia, and they were analphabetic. So they had to invent a language, which they, an alphabet called Vi, which they saw in dreams. And it's a little similar, the whole process, to the invention of the Cherokee alphabet. These alphabets became pictures, became signs for language. And a lot of people think now, linguists think, that that is how alphabetics and writing itself may have been invented whenever human beings first invented them. So these images are specters, sometimes they're comic specters. They're delirious because they come to us in dreams. They're oniric, again, the product of the imagination. They decompose and recompose. And these are all points that we're taking from this image, from this essay about the ontology of the image. They flood and yet are meager. They produce culpabilities of how we read the world and entangle themselves, all of us, in a kind of mutual conspiracy of meaning, which is what the speakers of any language enter into when they talk to each other. There is a conspiracy of what they agree meaning is made out of, and that's partly their unconscious processing visuality, partly the abstraction of signs and alphabets, and partly the deployment of language. And all of these shade off into the edges of uncertainties. And what's very interesting is that, like Monica and me and Jibesh, when we've been together with each other for so long, we often don't finish our sentences, and yet the other person knows what we mean, right? And this jumping over the synapse or the gap of unsaid things is as much a part of the enchantment of the unknown as anything else. It creates a kind of hole, perhaps, which we fill with our sense of each other.
Which is why we invented this, well, we emerged through conversations between us, the concept of the event-shaped whole. As you read here, a photograph is an image. Now, I think it's interesting because we often start our discussions in language using the image as a starting point, because of the fact that it, besides the fact that an image is, 1,000 words and so on, it is precisely that it is inexpressible, right? It cannot be found in, it cannot truly be expressed in language, no matter how much one describes it. But it becomes an interesting sort of contradiction. How does one try and find linguistically concepts that images offer? So there is always this kind of gap in the everyday, I suppose, between the kind of linguistic frame that we have for addressing each other in one modality, the imagistic, which we do share a lot amongst each other as well in another modality, and then trying to find this kind of bridge by which we can, as Shuddha said, perhaps finish each other's sentences in one sort of conceptual way, rather, in a more philosophical way, in a more propositional way, rather than just the fact that we also a little bit know how we all of us think because we know each other for so long. So this concept kind of emerged in that sense, thinking of the photograph as an event-shaped whole, because it witnesses to perforations that we could begin to act like protagonists in a Scandinavian crime thriller, building up layers of forensic interpretation onto the cavity of the event in order to transform the event-shaped whole into a rich account of making and unmaking of ways and forms of living. Usually we find a propositional cavity inside a document or a photograph or a report that needs filling in. So in order to, this is in a way kind of, earlier we were talking about the fact that an image that is not seen, is it an image, which is one order of existential balance that an image, which we can discuss around an image. But the other thing is that even an image that is qua image, that one can read as an image, what do we actually read in it, right? What is it that we think we know? There was actually an image I found today on a meme that I follow. I think it's called Nihilistic Chaos. And it's very funny, it's on Instagram. And there was a photograph because it was posted on Instagram. And it literally was, can you describe a single thing in the photograph? Now, it looks like a photograph. My eyes, because of the fact that it's Instagram and because it has the kind of contours in it that it is a photograph. But actually, I couldn't make sense of anything, even though it looked like a domestic scene. It was a fascinating quantity where neither the eye, nor the mind, nor the language, nor the sort of capacity for language could come to terms with what the image was doing. So it was an image that had nothing, even though it seemed to have so much in it. And in that sense, I mean, and I forwarded it to my colleagues. Partly, I think, as a form of note taking, which is what we do. But crucially, I think it really sort of renders, in a way, what we are trying to propose in a more abstract way, that every image is that which you think you know, but also that which you cannot know. And in that, you are always trying to what we address the image as a propositional cavity, right? It holds within itself so many other things. And when one is reading an image, one is also trying to read that which one doesn't know. That is why we're calling it an evincient whole. I'm sure there's going to be some more questions around it because I know it, but I find it very, very hard to express what the evincient whole really is. But perhaps some of you will understand. But we can come back to this later. So this is from a film we made recently called Deep Breath. A lot of things happen in it. It's a long film, but the sort of essence of this is that these divers find these letters, as you can see them beginning to find, and over a few minutes, they start to put this puzzle together. They find these elements, a syllabary in a way, as Shuddha was talking about, and they try to make meaning out of it. And they are able to make it. And the phrase they emerge with, we can't see the entire film, but the phrase they emerge with is forgetting of air. It is the phrase that Lucia Rigore reminds us of. And to us, it was quite important to shoot this film underwater, where the relationship with air was already is extremely aware relationship because you're underwater. But the reason that we're showing this is not necessarily the film. It is to talk about the idea of the submarine horizon. Because when you're underwater, when you're using the machine, as you can see, the prosthetic really, to extend the body, to achieve another kind of being, underwater, what happens is that, especially when you go into the deep, that there is no sense of a horizon, that there's also no up, no down. You are completely adrift in a different spatial universe. And what is interesting about this kind of experience, of course, is that while it might be terrifying, it is also permitting you, pushing you to figure things out anew. We wrote about this. It is said that we know more about faraway galaxies than we do about the bottom of the ocean on Earth. One could say something similar about a relationship to the future and to the contemporary. The distant future can seem more familiar than the deep present. And what else is contemporaneity but the deep present, the abyss of the now? How to dive without drowning in the turbulent waters of now? How to find and share sources of illumination in submarine darkness? When to surface, and how to ride a strong current? Why stay afloat on the present moment at all? And what to look for while beachcombing the seafloor of our time? you want to add to that, Shuddha?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's what we're talking about, this kind of unfamiliarity with that which is the closest to us. You've said that already, and that the enchanting limit of the everyday and of the unfamiliarity of the everyday is also a kind of distant planet, although we step into it all the time.
So one of the last things for tonight is a sculpture that you see in front of you. Imagine this 18th century South Indian automaton of a devouring tiger becoming a holy relic in 22nd century Europe. This is the conceit with which we had done the performance, The Return of Tipu's Tiger, a communique, as it were, from the future channeled by Raqs. And in our lecture performance, Tipu's Tiger had become an uncanny meme for Europe's presence in the world, a fantastical, funny reminder of the ongoing joust between defeat and victory, man and nature, human beings and machines. This is an overwhelming legacy, right? The legacy of the push that happens between centers of power and those who are considered not on on the edges, something which we are seeing happening again today in a different form. But it may especially be, but not only, of European history and of its encounter with the world. Through all the great wars, all the advertising, all the factories, focus groups, and firing squads, all those unknown lobotomized soldiers turned into stone in every small town square, all of that still haunts us and is reactivated whenever it suits. So the tiger and the soldier stay locked in battle, not letting go of each other or of their own nature. Another set of words that we invented, the mechano fetish and the bagazine. Now, the bag in Hindi is both tiger and garden, but here it's playing with the idea of the magazine, which is the gun, the machine of the magazine of the gun, and the tiger. And the reason we were doing that, and I think part of the thing that we do want to talk about a little bit today is in that sense that the machine is this kind of attempt at realizing ourselves and knowing ourselves in a different way, right? The automaton is an example of that. In this instance, you have the tiger eating the British soldier, which is what the automaton keeps doing. But but if you look at 18th century automatons, what is fascinating is that they are basically repeating human gestures. What people do quite easily, the fascinating thing has been, can a machine do what people do? And we do know that relationship with the self, of articulating the self outside of ourselves with the machine, has taken on with the gun, and then finally with things like the drone, where we can say that it wasn't our responsibility that the event happened, that the killing is not done by the human, it is done by the machine, in a sense, a kind of passing on of the agency that one has of creating a kind of gap of knowledge, a willing unknown, a willing fissure, a willing cleft between that which you know and that which you do not want to know, by saying it is the machine's responsibility. As we wrote in another context, the greatest achievement of our culture was the comfort it briefly derived from thinking that it had given up the capacity to harm the world. This was yoked to the premise that the source of all distress and danger now lay outside, in a forever elsewhere. That the never again slogan was a guarantee in time and in space that the borders were closed now to the agents of hatred. There was an ethical wall, which also acted as a moral sunscreen in place. It filtered the harsh light of time.
Now the problem is as follows, that the never again has to be said ever and ever again. While we, guiltless, guileless, innocent, forgotten what it means to be angry, We've solved the problem by pretending that it does not exist. The manticore, the man-tiger, acts for us, keeps us calm. But do we even know what it means to be beside ourselves? That is why Tipu's tiger still needs thinking about. And I know that the future of wars, and you know that the future of wars will be fought by drones. We will deploy them and stand back, guiltless, guileless, while the drones do the dropping of the bombs. The drone is the beast, the drone is the machine, the drone is the soldier. And that thing and we together are the unknown.
Do you have some time? Perhaps a few minutes? Are you listening now? Can you reach down under everything and listen to what is going on? Yes, there. I don't hear much. I don't hear anything. If it's not being said, it's not being said. What if it is being said, and it's just that it is not being heard? I wouldn't know what to say to that. Are you saying I'm hard of hearing? I didn't say that. Did you hear me say something that I didn't say? You didn't say it in so many words. How many words did I say it in? Do you have a measure for meaning that tells you what someone says, even if they didn't say it in so many words? I don't know where this is going. Does it amount to the same thing? Something left unspoken and something that is said, though no one has heard it? I couldn't say. I wouldn't hazard a guess. Is there a difference? Does it matter if there is? What do you think? Would you walk away from it? Would you stay, sitting, waiting? Would it exasperate you to try and find out if there is a difference, and then decipher the difference? I could think about it. Would you risk not understanding what you heard? Or what you did not hear? Would you admit it? Is there a no admission sign? No admission without comprehension? What about no comprehension without admission? What comes first? Hearing or understanding? Hearing, obviously. So what does it mean when we say, I am not hearing that? Or even, you are not listening to me? It means someone is making a decision not to hear something. Why?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Thanks, Shuddha. I think we want to open things quickly to conversation, but I'd like to start off by asking a question about these two terms of the unknown and enchantment. Because in the notes I was taking while you were talking, I wrote down that enchantment is to enchant ourselves, to embed oneself in the rhythm of the voice of the body politic, while the unknown is to be unsituated, in a sense, is to not have a certain kind of locality in oneself, or to look out from oneself and not see whether it's contextualization of some kind, a perspective that's political. And those terms seem to be, in fact, opposite of one another. They may not be in contradiction, but they present an opposition to that very intriguing idea of the image as an event-shaped whole, which made me think of a certain kind of localization of embedment, embedding that one has through, for example, Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida talks about the punctum, the idea that the photograph, in fact, is a puncturing. It's something that does, in fact, locate. It's at once, you might say in your own terms, an event-shaped whole, and yet it's the thing that pierces oneself in such a way that we are located in a memory, in something that is instantly contextualized. So how do you see these, the bridging of the situated and the unsituated in these two terms? Do we even want to situate ourselves? We've begun with a discussion of war, where we certainly don't want to situate ourselves. You know, you think of Baudelaire, Baudelaire's phrase in the poem in which he talks about anywhere out of the world. So how do you see these terms operating in that context?
Well, I mean, you know, what's really beautiful about the term enchantment is that it is usually brought into practice through the usage of something called a spell, right? And to spell is to spell, is to spell out the words. And it usually does one of two things. It either sort of lays a claim on what is not known, brings it into the territory of the familiar by saying, this unknown thing is now my familiar. And what do witches have? You know, their cats are their familiars. Or it produces some kind of way by which it can change the known into the unknown. It can produce uncertainty. And I think that in times where things seem to be completely out of our control, like in a time of war, where we might ask, what can you and I or anyone do to stop a war, right? Very little, yet we do what we need, what people go out in the streets and raise, and they raise a spell. They say no to war. That's a kind of spell, right? And if enough people do it in enough places in the world, if the spell catches on, then there is a chance that the war might end. I mean, I am constantly reminded of the fact that the First World War, which we did a lot of work on in Raqs a couple of years ago, actually ended in the Ukraine and in Russia, when in November 1917, the spell, the magic words, land, bread, peace, just 3 words. People kept saying, we need land, we need bread, and we want an end to the war. The war ended in Russia and in Ukraine because enough people said land, bread, peace. That's a kind of spell making. Today we look back on it and it's the Bolshevik Revolution, it's the beginning of many other things. It has its own tragedies, but for a brief moment, an entire population was able to stop a world war for itself. That's enchantment of a kind, right? And I think that this is the relationship that people who are poets, who are artists, have to the world. They can say sayable, that which seems impractical, that which seems completely outside, like Baudelaire says, from another world, but it is in this world. And it introduces a different kind of radical uncertainty into the sort of sudden certainty of war. And that is the uncertainty of the possibility of peace. I don't know if that addresses your question.
That's a start. Let's open it, thanks, Shuddha, to anyone's comments. In a normal seminar, of course, we would be the bad teacher to pick on people and say, what do you think?
We would also have some coffee.
And I would be tempted to do that. There are some very distinguished thinkers I'm seeing in our audience, I'm happy to say. And I would love to call on them, but I suppose that would be too authoritarian. Yes, I see a hand up. Camila.
Yes, hi. Actually, I was thinking throughout the whole talk about how much uncertainty and unknown there is to like human beings ourselves and within the human race, and something that you just touched on, you know, us being able to kind of like speak things into existence and actually have the power of the word to create reality. It really kind of like reminds me of the New Age spirituality that we are seeing throughout the whole world. And I say New Age, but really it's been around for like millennia and centuries. And I think it's really a really nice parallel to kind of like trace between discovering what's out there and discovering what's inside of us, but also like within the human race in general. I'm Argentinian, for example, and I'm currently based in Europe. And there's so much that we don't know about each other, you know. And at the beginning, you talked about the difference between a war in Yemen and a war in Europe. And I think that's a great way of saying, you know, what we consider neutral in general, especially in the places that have a lot of power in the media and in economies in general. I think it's there's a lot that we can learn about each other, and a lot of the projects that I see with people like me who come from places that are not very represented, we're trying to tell our story, and we're kind of trying to bring our own kind of like golden disc to Europe and the US, you know, kind of like this is our humanity, these are our languages, our customs. So yeah, just a thought, not really a question, but if it inspires conversation.
I remember a time when another big power invaded a very far away country, which was when Britain invaded Argentina. And you had a horrible Thatcherite regime fighting a horrible dictatorship in Argentina. And again, we were faced with the unknowns, right? The Falklands War was a very strange unknown. And it almost seemed a bit bizarre and magical. Why did this have to happen? But again, I think we need to look deep dive into the present moment to understand why the sudden uncertainty of war becomes such a terrible reality. And the answers to it are not only in the great powers. The answers to it lie in our homes, in our factories, in our workplaces, and in the way the world is run. So that's the everyday, which is unfamiliar, but is also familiar in a way.
Let me jump in and ask one other thing. So if we elongate this idea, how do we move from what is obviously our subject today, which is trauma, to the body politic, to a larger sense of how you see the unknown in terms simply of artistic practice, curatorial practice? You know, I'm thinking so much, as I have been since Okwe died, about the way that Okwe and Wizora opened things that had been suppressed, things that had been not known, and so eloquently used his curatorial platforms in order to make the unknown known, just in the ways you began this conversation in a way. So how do we extend this beyond our urgent subject of the moment? Or how do you extend it? How do you think about it?
I think there's categories of the unknown, right? One is that unknown which is known to some and not known to others, which is a function of history and power, and that, you know, that's one. The other one is none of us know things because, you know, thresholds of situations. They're just collective unknowns. Then there's a third thing, which is the unknown, right? Which is a kind of an interesting dilemma, because it's a kind of a knowing of the not knowing. the fact that they even it's like infinities within infinities. Even that which is unknown, you know that which is unknown and how unknown it is another order that has to be understood before one can come close to even calling it a certain order of unknown. I think that a lot of all artistic or curatorial practice kind of has to ricochet between all three of them, or weave between all three of them. Definitely what Okwi did, sometimes we're all interpolated, I think, in the sense of how does one acknowledge that the world has a sidelong glance towards things and a frontal glance towards others, and it turns its back on things completely. You know, we began by talking about Yemen and Ukraine, for example. That's one order of the unknown. But I think there is also another kind of fascination and joy, perhaps, in saying, when we can all agree that we don't know something, the question of how one finds a modality of thinking about it or finding something there, that's another, you know, like discovering new words that we do collectively. When one invents or conjugates something, and I think conjugating is a wonderful kind of verb. When you conjugate something, you are basically saying there's a coming together of that which I can express and that which I cannot express, not because I can't, but because there is no such frame for it. And let us invent a frame that you and I can share. The conspiracy that Shuddha talked about, or we had somewhere in a kind of a mutual conspiracy. Knowledge is a mutual conspiracy. Language is a mutual conspiracy of meaning. And I think that is, when we do those two things interestingly, then the unknowns can become more interesting for all of us together.
I remember that Okwi used to take great delight in a particular review that appeared after Documenta 11, in which a gentleman critic bemoaned the fact that now he was being asked to know about all these other modernities that happened in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Wasn't it enough that they had to know modernity as it appeared in the transatlantic sort of zone? And he said, you know what he's troubled by? He's troubled by the fact that all his knowledge is also got the flip side of all his ignorance. And that is a wonderful thing, because we might all know different things and we might know different amounts of things, but actually all of our ignorance is infinite. They are all infinite ignorances. And in ignorance, we are our equals. But it troubles some people, when they realize that they're as equal to anyone else in their ignorance of the world. And I think Okwi's curatorial practice really sharply revealed that equality of ignorance in the world.
Brian, I know you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, I can't help it. It's a bit maybe it's a cheating a bit to bring in what we discussed before the meeting began, but it's too tempting to ask you about insurance, which came up, but because I think it has such a close relationship to war as a kind of a conquest of the unknown, or as a way of kind of framing or limiting or attempting, always kind of with some kind of futility, but trying to isolate the unknown as a kind of an enemy, or as a kind of creating a kind of immunity, immune response to it. I wonder if you spoke a little bit about this work with the two motorcycles, but I tried to look it up and I couldn't find it. Now I'm very curious to hear more.
Yeah, let me describe.
Also with insurance more generally.
Yeah, I mean, this piece that we did a number of years ago was called Insurance Percentage Investment, and its central sort of visual. I mean, that's what I really wanted to do, but since we couldn't actually make a well of death, we went and shot it. But the well of death is often found in circuses in India, and we've all seen them till fairly recently, I would say. I think, well, not recently, maybe, I don't know if they still have them, but there is an actual, there's an actual kind of a well that is like a bowl, a big bowl that is made, and two motorcyclists start sort of just going round and round, and then at some point they start to take up speed, and the centrifugal force that emerges, it becomes a point when they're both riding literally perpendicular to all of us who are standing above them and watching them go. And it goes on for many minutes. And it's always kind of both exhilarating and terrifying, because you do not know if they can sustain it without crashing. And if they were to crash, their lives are utterly in danger. There are no safety nets or anything like that. And the reason we thought that it seemed apposite to use this as a visual metaphor for the work, for the title of the work. And it's one of those things where we don't know if the memory of these gentlemen made us think about insurance investment, or is it the other way around? But the fact is that when we walk into insuring a situation, basically there's a kind of a calculation that is done, which we all know about, but it hinges on the fact that someone else is investing in this as a calculation, right? So your insurance, the fact that the speculative nature of the fact, or it's not entirely speculative, there's mathematics to this, right? But X% of people, if they pay Y, it's okay, because only out of those X, only X minus 100 will need a certain sum of money. But what happens to that money? How can they? It's an investment scheme for many other people. It's very basic, but in a way we think of them as two discrete things. I'm investing my money here, and I'm insuring myself over there. And it seemed sometimes it's useful when you start saying that what one thinks one knows, and what one in the point A, and what one thinks one knows in point B, are actually the same thing. And so this business of that business of known actually becomes problematized. And I think that's fascinating, because this thing of segmented knowing is worse than actually saying I don't know, because of the veneer of and I think the language of experts, and the kind of the sectorization that is happening increasingly, and which is why we are now turning more and more to spells. We were talking about this just yesterday, Shuddha and I, about how the excess of, in a way, the experts have become like wizards who say things that I do not understand, who claim to have an understanding of a world and how it functions. I have no sort of grasp of it. Since I can't understand it, I might as well turn to the language of the shamanistic or the occult or astrology or whatever it is that seems to give me it seems to have an equal incapacity. Its unknowing mirrors my unknowing, rather than the unknowing of the expert who's knowing. It's another form of unknowing for me, but there is a veneer of knowingness over there. And I think it is in this business of what one knows, what one thinks one knows, and the fact that Shuddha was just saying, if we were to acknowledge the fact that there is an equal ignorance, or what was that, an equal amount of unknowing, we might have a more I don't know. It might be a limit that is an opening limit rather than an ending limit.
I mean, I think we must always read the fine print of insurance documents, and they always mention acts of God and war. So you're insured against everything other than the acts of God and war, which is a very interesting thing, because insurance calculations are based on actuarial tables, which are mortality statistics. And the moment war enters the equation, the ordinary mortality statistic goes completely haywire. So the tables that the insurance industry sits on are actually upended by the logic of war. At the same time, the driving force of the world economy today is a war economy, right? I mean, so much is invested in the military industrial complex so much of the armaments take up the substance of what economic decisions are. So the real world operates of being forever prepared for that which insurance documents say we must never be taking into account. There's a paradox here somewhere. I mean, if one looks at the military budgets of all the countries, there's the United States, which has, I believe, 3 times the military budget of all the militaries of the world combined, or Russia or India, which is the largest military spender in Asia. You have that huge sum of actual money on the one hand, and then the uncertainty of what would happen if you were caught in a war. Nothing would be able to insure you.
Anyone else? Any other questions or comments? No? Well, okay, in that case, how can I resist but saying we have all been enchanted? And thank you so much, Monica and Shuddha, for spending this time so that we could think together about these things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll lift the spell now.
Okay, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Yes.
Good night.
Unmute yourselves and let's have a moment of applause. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye-bye.